checked my bank account while sitting in a house I had paid $35,000 to build, and the number staring back at me was $4,200. 3 years earlier, that account had held just over $120,000. I remember refreshing the screen more than once because I honestly thought there had to be a mistake. But there wasn't. The number did not change. And in that quiet moment, I realized that the simple math I had trusted so completely had collapsed. When I first moved to the Philippines, I had convinced myself that if I lived on about $700 a month, my savings would last at least 15 years. I had even written it down on paper. 120,000 divided by 700 equals freedom. 15 years of breathing room. 15 years of not waking up to an alarm clock. 15 years of finally living instead of surviving. What I did not understand at the time was that retirement math looks very clean on paper, but life has a way of inserting expenses that do not show up in spreadsheets. And that is how $120,000 became $4,200 in just 3 years. When I left the United States, I was not wealthy. I was tired. After decades of working and 2 failed marriages, I had accumulated a modest $401k that I chose to cash out early. I paid the penalties. I accepted the taxes. When everything settled, I had just over $120,000 available to me, and in my mind that represented a second chance. Online forums and videos had shown me that life in the Philippines could be simple and affordable. Rent could be $400, food maybe $300, utilities another $100. If I stayed disciplined, I could live comfortably on $700 a month. That was the plan, and at first, it seemed realistic. The first few months felt like confirmation that I had made the right decision. I found a small condominium in a decent area, ate out frequently, because the prices felt unbelievably low compared to back home, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of not rushing anywhere. I told myself that even if I spent a little extra in the beginning, it was just part of settling in. But I was not spending $700 a month. I was spending closer to $1,200, sometimes more. Nights out, taxis instead of public transport, small luxuries that felt justified because I had earned them. None of it felt reckless. Each expense had a reason, and because my account balance was still high, I did not feel urgency. Then I met someone. She was not dramatic. She did not immediately ask for money. In fact, that was part of what convinced me she was different. Being around her made my life feel stable, and when she eventually moved in with me, I believed that I had solved my biggest financial leak. I stopped going out as much, and I told myself I was finally being responsible. What I did not see at the time was that the spending did not disappear. It simply shifted. The first request was small and seemed reasonable. A medical issue in the family that required help. It was temporary, and the amount was manageable. Then there were school fees, then another emergency. Each time, the explanation made sense. Each time, I agreed, because I believed that being generous was part of being a good partner. Over time, the support became monthly. $300 became $500. $500 became $700. I never felt forced. I never felt threatened. I chose to help, and in doing so I convinced myself that I was investing in something meaningful. The truth is that I was slowly blending my savings into a life structure that depended on them. Her family offered land where we could build something permanent. No more rent. No more moving. The estimate came back at roughly $35,000, and I justified it by telling myself that it would eliminate future expenses. Owning something after a lifetime of renting felt powerful, and I allowed that feeling to override the legal reality that I could not actually own the land beneath it. The construction took months, and watching the walls go up felt like progress. It felt like I was building stability. But when the final payment was sent, I had removed a significant portion of my safety net. And I did so willingly, because emotionally it felt like security. That is when the business ideas began. I did not want to be the man who simply burned through savings, so when opportunities were presented to invest in small ventures, they sounded logical. A farm, a trading opportunity, a modest buy and sell operation. Each one came with projections and promises, and each one required just enough capital to seem reasonable. Individually, none of the amounts seemed catastrophic. Collectively, they eroded the foundation I had built my retirement on. After the house was completed, I should have slowed down. That would have been the disciplined move. Instead, I felt pressure to justify the decision. $35,000 had already left my account, and in my mind, that meant I needed to make the remaining money work harder. I did not want to be seen as someone who simply arrived with savings and slowly watched them disappear. When small business ideas were introduced, they did not feel reckless. They felt responsible. Each one was presented as a way to generate income so that we would not rely solely on my remaining savings. The numbers were explained carefully. The risks were described as manageable. The profits were framed as realistic. And I wanted to believe that. The first investment was not enormous. It felt like a manageable experiment. When it failed, I accepted it as bad luck. The second investment required a larger amount, but by that point I had already committed so much emotionally that backing out would have felt like distrust. I told myself that temporary setbacks are part of any entrepreneurial journey. I had read that phrase many times. But retirement savings are not venture capital. Every transfer reduced not only my balance, but also my margin for error. What made it worse was that none of the losses felt immediate. There was no single catastrophic moment. There was no dramatic theft or obvious deception. There were just delays, explanations, weather events, logistical complications, and promises that things would stabilize soon. By the time I realized how quickly the account was shrinking, I had already normalized the outflow. I remember the first time I saw the balance drop below $60,000. That number should have alarmed me. Instead, I reassured myself that I still had more than enough to adjust. I began doing smaller calculations in my head, telling myself that even if the original 15-year plan was unrealistic, 10 years was still possible. Then 8. Then maybe 5. What I did not account for was the psychological effect of watching a safety net shrink. When savings feel abundant, generosity feels easy. When savings begin to tighten, fear enters the room quietly. And fear changes how you think. I started checking the account more often. I became more irritable without understanding why. I found myself doing new math late at night, calculating how long the remaining balance would last if all outside support stopped immediately. But by then, stopping did not feel simple. There were expectations. There were obligations. There was a house built on family land. There were relationships intertwined with financial support. Then came the morning that reset everything. I woke up early before anyone else and logged into my account while sitting at the small dining table overlooking the rice fields. The house was quiet. The air was still. It should have been peaceful. The number on the screen read $4,200. For a moment I felt detached, as if I were looking at someone else's life. I refreshed the page more than once. I even checked the transaction history to make sure there had not been an error. There wasn't. 3 years earlier, I had arrived believing that I had built a 15-year runway. Now, I had less than 2 months of comfortable living left. When I finally said the words out loud later that day, they sounded unreal. I explained that the savings were almost gone, that we needed to adjust immediately, that the lifestyle we had grown accustomed to was not sustainable. I expected concern. I expected fear. What I saw instead was calculation. It was not anger. It was not cruelty. It was simply a shift in tone. Questions about what was left. Questions about future plans. Questions about whether income was possible from elsewhere. And in that moment, I understood something that had taken me 3 years to see clearly. I had built a life that was supported by a finite resource, and when that resource disappeared, the structure weakened. There was no dramatic scene. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just a growing distance that became impossible to ignore. The confidence that once surrounded our plans dissolved into practicality. What had once felt like partnership began to feel transactional. Within weeks, I found myself packing again, not because anyone forced me out in anger, but because the reality of the situation was unavoidable. Without income, without savings, and without legal ownership of the land beneath the house, my position was fragile. The bus ride away from the province was quiet. I watched the landscape pass by and replayed every decision that had felt harmless at the time. None of them had seemed foolish when they were made. Each one had been justified by hope, emotion, or logic that felt reasonable in isolation. That was the most painful realization. I was not robbed in a single moment. I eroded my own stability through a series of decisions that felt small at the time. Returning to work in the United States was not part of the plan I had imagined when I first left. Taking a physically demanding job in my 60s was humbling. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing you once had enough to stop and now you must start again. But rebuilding, even slowly, brought clarity. I no longer view retirement as an escape. I view it as a structure that must be protected. Savings are not freedom if they are not managed with discipline. Generosity is not sustainable if it is not balanced with long-term security. Love does not replace math. Would I ever live overseas again? Possibly. But I would never repeat the same approach. I would never cash out everything without a continuing income stream. I would never invest significant amounts without independent oversight. I would never blend finances deeply, without years of proven stability. And I would never confuse feeling valued with being financially secure. The Philippines did not take my money. My decisions did. And that distinction matters. Because if the mistake were purely external, I would have learned nothing. The hard lesson was internal. Discipline matters more than optimism. Patience matters more than speed. And retirement math only works when you protect it from emotional spending. $120,000 felt like a lifetime when I arrived. $4,200 felt like a warning when I left. Now, rebuilding slowly, dollar by dollar, I understand something I did not understand back then. Freedom is not the amount you bring with you. Freedom is the structure you build around what you have. And if someone listening to this is considering the same leap I once took, I hope this story does not discourage you from dreaming. I hope it encourages you to prepare. Because the difference between 15 years and 3 is not luck. It is discipline.